Hey everybody, Andrew Pierce here, CEO, therapist, chief cook and bottle washer at Blueprint Therapy Solutions in Woodbury, Minnesota. This is your driving around with your therapist installment. I got to thinking there's a real epidemic these days of, I guess you could say it's a lack of accountability. Blaming, basically. And it seems to have become more and more ingrained as a social norm for various reasons. You know, everybody gets a trophy. It's okay if you're engaged in some sort of destructive, self-destructive activity, as long as you're happy. A significant disregard, I guess, for social context and the impact that our choices have on other people. And this is sort of a carryover, really, from addiction. I mean, the only difference is people in addiction literally have a problem with their architecture of their brain and the chemistry and so on, which can be resolved with by a number of means. But whether it's getting new information. Those types of problems can be fixed internally. And if they can be fixed internally by people with addiction problems, then there's actually less of a reason why they couldn't be resolved by people without addiction problems. People's taking accountability for their state of being and their reactivity to environmental factors, nouns, people, places, and things, right? I guess the only difference is, whereas, let's say, alcoholics, just for the sake of simplicity, have to develop the appropriate mindsets to take accountability for what goes into their mouth, right? By the same token, codependents and other people in general need to develop the capacity to take responsibility, accountability for what comes out of their mouth, right? So the mouth is the conduit, whether it's alcoholism or behaviors or words that seem to come out and are justified by excuses or reasons such as triggers and other things. People fail to realize when it comes to triggers, for instance, people say, well, they triggered me, and therefore fill in the blank with whatever bullshit comes out of their mouth, right? Or actions they take. That's not taking accountability for, our behaviors, our choices, right? And of course, there are consequences. But people who experience the consequences of not taking accountability for their choices also feel it's unjust. It's unjust, right? Because they feel, self-righteous indignation when they're held accountable by other people for what they would not hold themselves accountable for, if that makes any sense. So, just using the simple trigger example, right? There is a gap, if you will, between a trigger and a choice and a behavior, right? It's not just trigger, behavior. I'm totally unaccountable for whatever the behavior is because of the trigger. There's a gap there, and it only takes 70 milliseconds for the brain to do the calculus, right? But if we're conditioned or taught that we don't have, that there's a trigger and therefore we can justify any behavior based on what's going on in our environment, well, that's not how things work in the real world, especially in business and interpersonal relationships, unless you're dealing with somebody who also buys into that myth, which is, unfortunately, a lot of people. So, within that gap between the trigger or event that occurred and the choice and corresponding behavior of that choice is a gap, right? It's very small, but that's where accountability resides, right? In other words, we don't have to be reflexive in our reactions to our environment. And in fact, people recovering from addiction realize this. They're forced to realize this, right? They can no longer blame their external environment for their choice to drink like they probably used to. You know, the classic one is, well, you'd drink too if you were married to them, or if you had this stressor in your life, and so on, without maybe taking into account that they're the one that chose to be around that stressor. Right? But that, again, that's an accountability issue. So I think that, there's like an epidemic of unaccountability, and it's all because of a thinking error. The logical error is called control fallacy, and people buy into it, the belief that their behaviors are dictated by environmental factors. And it's just false. It's convenient, but false. And when people start realizing this and acting accordingly and develop the ability to think about what they're thinking about in that millisecond following some acute event, you know, somebody cuts you off in traffic, somebody calls you fat, whatever, right? You know, we don't have to respond, nor can we logically justify whatever response is simply because they said this or they did that. I mean, you can, and there's plenty of idiots, useful idiots, that are happy to perpetuate that myth, unfortunately. But if you really want to learn how to take control of your life and your state of being, it's useful to employ the skills of somebody who teaches about non-reactivity. Folks like me, right? I had to learn with my ability to refrain from addictive behaviors, and if people in addiction can change, then anybody can change. It's even easier, but it allows people to take the reins, to take control of their destiny, which is ultimately a good thing. And going through that one-time change process, developing the self-awareness necessary to take accountability for our choices, is an invaluable gift that will pay dividends indefinitely, because so few people do it, but it's such a valuable attribute. If you want to learn more, feel free to reach out in the comments. Feel free to call. The phone number at Blueprint Therapy Solutions in Woodbury, Minnesota is 651-424-1967. You can also reach us at blueprinttherapysolutions.com, and I'm Andrew at blueprinttherapysolutions.com. I hope you have a great day, because you're responsible for the kind of day you have from now on.